by American men and women. And let me tell you, we owe them. We owe them the chance to go to work each day, knowing they have the thanks of a grateful nation.
What Vice President-elect Joe Biden didn't mention is that many of those buildings were built by slaves. Indeed, as the first African-American president in U.S. history, Barack Obama and his wife Michelle and 2 daughters, Malia and Sasha, will be taking up residence in the White House, a house built by slaves. Michelle Obama and her daughters are descendants of slaves. The Capitol, too, was built by slaves, as was the Supreme Court. Last night, I spoke with AP reporter Jesse Holland. He's the author of Black Men Built the Capitol, Discovering African-American History in and Around Washington, D.C.
The legacy of our forefathers that we celebrate today.
Standing out there in front of the U.S. Capitol will be Barack Obama, who will become the most powerful man in the United States, an African-American president. But he's going to be standing in front of a building that was created and built by some of the least powerful people in the United States, African-American slaves. Through research, we've been able to determine that just about 400 of the more than 600 people who worked on the construction of the Capitol were African-American slaves. Maybe another 50 or so were African-American freedmen. These are people who had their papers to signify that they were free. So the entire building, the center of democracy in the United States, was created by African-American slaves.
And the documents that prove this?
The reason why we know this for a fact is because the federal government rented slaves from plantations in Virginia, Maryland, and in the District of Columbia. The government had to write receipts for the use of these slaves, and those receipts still exist at the National Archives and the Library of Congress. Through meticulous searching through those archives, we've been able to determine almost precisely that just about 400 of the workers who created the U.S. Capitol were slaves.
The year?
This was in the construction of the Capitol began in the early 1700s, and it finished directly before the Civil War. Actually, one of the better stories comes at that time, directly before the Civil War. To complete the Capitol, they wanted to put a statue on top of the Capitol dome. And an American art student in Paris wins the competition and creates the Statue of Freedom, a statue that today sits on top of the dome. He takes a picture of this statue and he sends it back to the United States, and it wins the competition. But the person in charge of the construction of the Capitol at that time was the Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, who would go on to be the President of the Confederacy. Well, when Jefferson Davis saw the picture of the Statue of Freedom, he threatened to cancel the entire project. The reason why is because Thomas Crawford, the art student who created the Statue of Freedom, had placed on top of the Statue of Freedom what was called a Liberty Cap. Well, Jefferson Davis was a student of Roman history, and he knew what a Liberty Cap signified. What a Liberty Cap tells the world is that that person wearing the Liberty Cap is a freed slave. So what Thomas Crawford wanted to put on top of the Capitol was a statue of a freed slave. Well, when Jefferson Davis sees this, he goes ballistic. He says he is not going to put a statue of a freed slave on top of the U.S. Capitol. And he tells Thomas Crawford that you either change the statue or we're going to cancel the entire project. Well, Crawford's an art student, and he needed the commission money. But the only thing he did was he took off the Liberty Cap and put on an American Eagle helmet. So when most people look at that Statue of Freedom, when they see the Statue of Freedom behind Barack Obama on Inauguration Day, most people are going to think that that's a statue of a Native American. No, it's actually a statue of a freed slave with an American Eagle helmet on top.
Who is Phillip Reed?
That same story continues. Phillip Reed was an African-American slave from Charleston, South Carolina. He was brought up to Washington, D.C. by his master, Clark Mills, who was a famous ironworker in Washington, D.C. We know Clark Mills today because he was commissioned and created the statue of General Lafayette that sits in front of the White House, which is why the park in front of the White House is known as Lafayette Park. Well, he buys Phillip Reed out of Charleston, South Carolina, and brings him up to Washington, D.C. Clark Mills gets the contract to bronze the Statue of Freedom. Well, when Thomas Crawford finally gets the completed, finished designs for the Statue of Freedom, he creates a life-size model out of plaster. He takes apart this plaster model into 5 different pieces, and he puts it on a ship for America. Now, unfortunately, Thomas Crawford dies before the statue reaches American shores. But luckily, he had put on that ship with the Statue of Freedom an Italian workman, whose only job was to take these 5 pieces of the statue apart and put the pieces back together and not break them because they were made out of plaster. Well, the statue comes across the Atlantic up the Potomac and is put together in the space between the Capitol and where the Supreme Court is now. And people from all around Washington, D.C. come to the Capitol and they see this plaster model, this 80-foot plaster model of what the Statue of Freedom is going to look like. And everyone goes, ooh, ah, what a wonderful statue. Well, it's at this point the Italian workman has an idea. He tells the Capitol commissioners that the person who created this statue is dead, so you can't make another copy of it. There's only one person on this entire continent who knows how to take this plaster statue apart without breaking it, and that's him. So he tells the government that if they don't pay him 3 times his agreed upon wages, he's going to refuse to take the statue back apart. Well, the government didn't take well to that ultimatum, so they decided that they would just let that statue sit on the ground between the Capitol and the Supreme Court. Well, Clark Mills had won the contract to bronze the Statue of Freedom, so he really needed to get that statue, that plaster model apart without breaking it. So he asked around, and the only person who had the skills to take that plaster statue apart was Phillip Reed. What he did was he tied a rope to the top of the statue, and he threw the rope over the top of a tall tree, and he put 3 or 4 strong men at the end of the rope and told them to pull. As the statue slowly rose off the ground, the 4 separators between the 5 pieces opened just a crack, and they were able to see inside the statue and figure out how to take it apart without breaking it. So if not for an African-American slave named Phillip Reed, the Statue of Freedom might still be sitting on the ground between the Capitol and the Supreme Court. But the story doesn't even end there. Clark Mills gets those 5 pieces of the Statue of Freedom out to his foundry in Bladensburg, Maryland. Now, his job was to get this statue bronzed by the time the construction on the Capitol was complete. So he had a deadline. The controversy with the Italian workman had lost him a lot of time off of his schedule. So it's now a rush job. So that's when the foreman of the foundry of Clark Mills Foundry has an idea. He says, Mr. Mills, you now have to get this job done quickly, and you have to get it done right. And the only person who can run this foundry the way it should be run, and the only person who can get this job done the way it should be done is me. So, Mr. Mills, you're going to pay me 3 times my agreed upon salary. So what did Clark Mills do? He fires him. And then he looks around and says, who can run this factory? Who can run this foundry the way it should be run? Who can get this job done on time? Who can lead these ironworkers into bronzing this statue? The only person he could find to do it correctly was once again Phillip Reed. So an African-American slave was the person put in charge of bronzing the Statue of Freedom. Now that's irony for you. A slave is a person in charge of bronzing the Statue of Freedom that's going on top of the Capitol. And well, the job was done on time and under budget.
Jesse Holland is an Associated Press reporter. We're going to come back to his description of Washington, D.C. and who built it. His new book is called Black Men Built the Capitol, Discovering African-American History in and Around Washington, D.C. Stay with us.
But if we are wise, we know that there